Hi, I'm Tyler from the Econ Tutoring Center at ASU, and today we're going to be doing a video on tariffs and quotas and how they affect an importing country. So this is just a basic supply and demand graph for a country that doesn't operate in free trade. So they have the domestic demand, the domestic supply, and then they have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. This is pretty basic. But now what happens is it opens up to free trade, and there is now a new world price that's lower than the equilibrium price in the domestic market. So I'm going to call this PW, and remember the notation might be different that your professor uses, so I'm going to use P like W, but they might use something different, so just check that. And so since it's lower, now the people who want it at this, more people want it at this lower price, they can find this in the importing market essentially. So normally if there wasn't trade, at this price there would be a shortage, and then it would end up going back up to the equilibrium price, but it's open to the free market. These people can get it at this price, and so what happens is the consumers in the market now consume a higher quantity. I'm just going to call this 10, and the suppliers in the domestic market now produce a lower quantity because they are only getting a lower price than they were before, so it just doesn't make sense for them to produce as much. So they're going to produce this quantity, and I'm going to call that 2, just to make things easier later. So I'm going to erase the previous equilibria, just so it doesn't get too cluttered. So this is now the new equilibrium, essentially, the free trade equilibrium, you could call it. Consumers consume 10, producers produce 2, so that means that they import this quantity. So this is the new equilibrium for this domestic country under free trade. So you can call it the free trade equilibrium. Like I said, notation and terms are going to be different over professors. But so now under this free trade equilibrium, domestic consumers, people in the country, now get to consume 10 of this good, and producers in this country, the domestic producers, now only produce 2. So in the domestic market, there's a shortage of 8, right? But where does that come from? If they're consuming 10 and they're only producing 2, you import 8. So again, domestic producers are producing 2 units, we're importing 8 for a total consumption of 10. So now let's just say the government of this country decided that the domestic producers were hurt by this, that they're suffering because they're now only producing 2 units at a lower price. It's hurting them, definitely. And there's a couple different ways that they can try and fix that. One is called a tariff. It's basically a tax on every unit of whatever this good is imported. So let's just say that it's $1. Ooh, I'm going to put a price in for the world too. Let's just say that this is $3, the world price. And let's say they put a $1 tariff on it. It doesn't necessarily take it back up to the demand or the previous domestic autarky equilibrium. Autarky means there's no trade, but it helps. First, let's look to see how much we import. So before we imported 8, right? Now we have 8 consumed and 4 produced domestically, so we have to import 4. And then I'll put the 8 in there just to see. So to summarize tariffs, we're essentially effectively increasing the world price, which helps domestic producers because they get to produce more at a higher price, hurts domestic consumers because they buy less at a higher price, and it helps the government a little bit, and it hurts exporting country, the foreign country, and so there might be some retaliation on that, but we'll get into that later. And we'll also go into the math on this in a later video, but just conceptually, overview, higher world price, which leads to less imported, less consumed, and more produced domestically. So the other way that a government can essentially help or protect a domestic industry other than tariffs is called a quota. And what a quota is, rather than increasing the price, we say we can only import this many. You're only going to allow imports of 10, 20, a certain number of imports. And it has the same effect. So if we wanted to, I'm going to erase the new world price because it doesn't actually change. We're just going to say you can only import 4 units. and that's these 4 right here. So it's wherever the distance between the domestic demand and the domestic supply is 4 in this case, and so that's here. So what that does is essentially, it doesn't raise the world price, but it puts us on an equilibrium where the price is 4, because you can't get any more, so the world price doesn't really matter. So we're still at a equilibrium of 4, it's just not necessarily the new world price. So again, this has the exact same effect as the tariff in decreasing imports from 8 to 4, helping domestic producers produce more at the higher price, hurting domestic consumers by consuming less at a higher price. So the main takeaway here is that there's 2 different ways that you can, a government can protect domestic industry essentially, and that's a quota and a tariff. They both have the exact same, or if done right, if calibrated together, they have the exact same effect on imports, same effect on price, and same effect on, you know, welfare of domestic consumers and domestic producers. So they help domestic producers, more goods at a higher price. They hurt domestic consumers, less goods at a higher price. They can help the government if they get government revenue from the tariff explicitly, or they can like auction the rights to a quota. That's more complicated, we'll get into that later. Yeah, there are both ways that they can restrict trade to help domestic producers. So there's been a lot of talk of like tariffs and, you know, trade restrictions in the news lately. Seeing here, it helps the domestic producers, but it hurts every domestic consumer. Just like think about that, and there might be like retaliation on behalf of like the foreign countries. Like I know Mexico has talked about that. Like if we put a tariff on their goods, they're gonna put a tariff on ours, and it's gonna hurt us too. So, anyways, this is like the economic effects of a tariff, like actually who it affects. So just keep that in mind. I hope this helped. If you need anything, leave a comment in the video below or come into the tutoring center and we'll try and answer questions.